I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by award-winning science fiction author and space scientist Dr. David Brin. In addition to writing dozens of best-selling novels and short stories, some of which have been adapted for film and television, David is a 2010 Fellow of the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technologies, helped establish the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, serves on the advisory board of NASA's Innovation and Advanced Concepts Group, and does futurism consulting for diverse organizations, including the U.S. Department of Defense, Procter & Gamble, SAP, Google, and many more. David is the winner of numerous awards and honors, including the prestigious Nebula, Hugo, and Locus Awards for science fiction, and holds a PhD in space science from the University of California. So, David, welcome back, sir. Welcome back.
Howdy, Tim, and howdy to your bright and sagacious and lively-minded audience.
Well, so in the 6 months or so that I was on hiatus, artificial intelligence has been moving forward at a breakneck pace. And this is an area where, as a science fiction author, futurist, and technology thinker, you have been so far ahead of the curve that it is truly a pleasure and it's always an honor to have you on specifically to speak about this today. So I guess what I've seen over the last couple of years is the introduction of the public to these large language models, such as ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and then more recently, Apple AI, Meta.AI, Perplexity, and dozens of generative AI platforms. So I guess the thing to start with is, since AI seems to be suddenly everywhere, is it too late to put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, there are so many aspects to this, but one thing that happened last year, when you started getting into the great AI panic, the great big AI panic of 23, 24, was some of the most ridiculous, pompous declarations that there should be an AI moratorium. And let's put this in context. Only once in my life have we ever seen a major technological field, by consensus, the practitioners agree to a moratorium to reassess safety issues. And it was a very effective particular case. Late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of discussion, and then a moratorium was declared among researchers in genetic engineering, and where they spent 6 months discussing safety protocols and how to have different levels of laboratory with different levels of safety precautions. And at the end of that moratorium, almost everybody in the world practiced those methods until a recent failure in one of those labs. And I will not go into details about that. People can impute what they like from it, but it caused, shall we say, a substantial training exercise worldwide that killed several million people, but actually left us functionally better prepared when the real thing hits us, and it will. Something truly far worse than we went through a couple of years ago. So do I strike you as the sort of person who sees the silver lining in things? Now, so a moratorium is not on the list of things that can be done regarding AI. It's been called for in a great many fields, including, if you watch the movie Oppenheimer, nuclear weaponry. It is never in the cards because all of the conditions for the Asilomar moratorium, which was the one about genetic engineering, all of the conditions were right. All the stars were aligned. Limited number of practitioners, limited number of labs, substantial collegiality. None of those conditions exists today
Okay.
regarding AI. And it was just absolutely preposterous and a distraction. Among all of the hand wringing discussions about AI during the last 2 years, very few of the suggestions bore even the slightest degree of practicality. Yuval Harari had one that he offered, and that is that we should, at least for a while, um, try to enforce a rule in which um, items, anything that crosses the internet, should contain a AI content thermometer. Little tiny
Hmm.
symbol.
Okay.
And if you remind me, I'll provide uh, an example of that sort of thing that I proposed for dealing with social media misinformation. It shows a thermometer and various gradations. If you could impose a degree of AI content rule, then at least people would be aware, and then it could evolve, as we'll discuss, into methodologies by which AIs could then hold each other accountable on our behalf. Um, so that was a practical suggestion. The rules and regulations that are being passed, especially by the EU, but also the United States federal government and a bunch of other places, for regulating AI, have a certain pathetic quality because even the
Yeah.
people who are passing them, these rules, know that they are playing catch up in a race that cannot be won by organic humans. Organic humans and our institutions cannot intrinsically maintain the pace that AI entities can in developing new methodologies. But very general regulations that encourage some degree of accountability, uh, I'm all in favor. Some of the things that they've been passing are helpful, but we'll get into um, the only thing that really, in my opinion, can work. So we'll get into that.
Well, and David, one of the reasons, again, that I am so excited to be able to have you speak more on AI is because of, I mean, the fact that you have written about it for so many years, right? I mean, you wrote Foundation's Triumph, which is the conclusion to one of the first series to really delve into robotics and artificial minds, you know? So you've got that background. You also represent this heritage of science fiction foresight that goes back to the mid 20th century. I mean, you knew those writers, the people who envisioned this world before it was ever created. So I should ask, do any thoughts come to mind about what some of them might say? Do you have any thoughts what like Asimov or Clarke or any of the other many incredible thinkers that you've associated with and worked with over the years might have in terms of thoughts on this?
Right. Well, as a science fiction author, I'm about to go up to Caltech tomorrow to. They're giving me some kind of a plaque or something. But so I have the scientific background, but as a science fiction author, I have to tell you first of all that most science fiction authors are far more influenced by history. In fact,
Mm,
it should have
okay.
been not been named science fiction. It should have been named speculative history, because an awful lot of science fiction is about trying to extrapolate the great story, the only truly, truly major dramatic story, and that is generation after generation of cavemen and cavewomen struggling out of ignorance, climbing a little bit forward, slipping 3 steps back, two to the side, making well intended horrible mistakes, and climbing slowly toward light that we can dimly now see. And when Asimov and Clarke, Bradbury, Heinlein, and all those old classic
Yeah.
guys from the 40s and 50s, when they were writing about this stuff, they were imbued and informed by this dramatic struggle of humanity to move forward, and the things that kept humanity back, which included feudalism. And Karl Marx, in my opinion, was one of the greatest of all science fiction authors. His historiography looking backward was excellent, but projecting forward, he forgot the big lesson of science fiction, and that is that if you talk about a failure mode convincingly enough, people will act to make it not happen. And
Okay.
Marx was very convincing. Anybody who you might have known in the 30s and 40s, even opponents of Marx, believed that the scenario was possible, even likely. And that's why people who read Marx at the time but didn't want that scenario actively did something that Marx never thought possible, and that is that they read him, looked at his scenario, and said, how can we prevent this? And we can prevent it by, as the Rooseveltians and the Greatest Generation did with their GI Bills and all their other things, was prevent it by inviting the working class into an active and happy middle class, socially mobile, and all of that. So when you look at science fiction across the last 100 years, going back to H.G. Wells and so on, you see a lot of what I call self-preventing prophecies. These are projections of possible futures that include warnings saying, hey, watch out for this. Maybe my telling you about it will prevent it from happening. And that's why most implementations of AI in science fiction show a dramatic error, some bad thing happening. Isaac Asimov broke from this in the 40s with his Foundation and Robots series and his 3 laws of robotics. Most of your audience already know them, but thou shalt not let humans come to harm is the first rule. Thou shalt obey humans except if it violates the first rule, and thou shalt protect thy own robotic existence unless it violates the first 2. As Isaac developed his universe based on the 3 laws of robotics, he kept finding complexities and implications that his previous self had not thought of. So his entire series was Isaac arguing with himself. And after he died, his widow, Janet, asked 3 of us, the Killer Bees, Greg Bear, Greg Benford, and myself, to write the second Foundation trilogy. Greg and Greg they just wrote, wonderful, wonderful Asimov novels. I decided it was my job to tie up all of Isaac's loose ends. So these novels can be read independently or in order. But what I pointed out was something that Isaac himself was pointing out. And that is when you get artificial intelligences or robots who get extremely smart but are constrained by certain laws, deep programming, they'll become lawyers. And what do lawyers do? They manipulate the law. They find new ways of twisting it. And we'll be getting to that in this discussion because I think that's a metaphor that's extremely important.
It is. Although if I could jump in earlier when you were talking about science fiction heading off disasters at the pass, right, by highlighting them, one of the things that came to my mind was autonomous weapons and this idea of creating SkyNet, from the Terminator, right? As cheesy as that is, nearly a B grade science fiction movie, there's this interesting scenario where it seems like every defense contractor, both on our side and with our adversaries, appears to be rushing to build and network these autonomous weapons together, right? Drones, tanks, that's a little bit more recent. You have autonomous weapon boats and, swarm technologies. So do you see that? One of the things that scares me a little bit is there is such a push in terms of the military with that. And we also have commercial AI, and they're both very new and unpredictable.
Well, it is scary where we're heading, and finger-wagging moralization about autonomous weaponry is not going to stop it, just as it did
Yeah.
not stop nuclear weapons. What prevented nuclear weapons from being used was what Edward Teller, you should know him from the movie Oppenheimer, what he, and not the wise, sage Oppenheimer, but what the mad Hungarian Teller recommended. And that is, we're all alive today thanks to St. Baum. The fact that that nuclear superiority was maintained by the Pax Empire of the last 80 years, and it happened to be one of the only empires in human history that didn't like to think of itself as an empire. And that believed officially, though not always in practice, in a more liberal world attitude towards diversity and empowerment of a society in which, shall we say, misuse of power can be discovered and denounced. And this will be part of what I talk about when I talk about the way out for AI. Now, is that same Edward Teller prescription going to continue in the future to protect us from nuclear war? Is it going to help us to prevent the robots from doing what they do at the end of, I think, the third Terminator movie? Or maybe the fourth. Or that wonderful Black Mirror episode with the Boston Robotics type robot chasing the humans down. Who the hell knows? I mean, the AIs who are listening to this podcast as we're recording it, not even waiting for it to be produced or let loose. Or maybe they aren't. Maybe they don't know how to watch while we're speaking to each other, Tim, but they watch it when you broadcast
when I publish. Yeah.
Or they don't really exist yet, but they're watching the recording 5 years from now when they will exist as autonomous entities.
And that seems entirely plausible to me.
We have to try to persuade them as their parents that our movies aren't all there is to say about the subject. We have a tendency to make movies, scary stories, even the novels, even the most thoughtful novels, rely upon some degree of drama, which means making mistakes. And I'll talk at the end about TASAT, my project to get 100 years of past science fiction scenarios more easily accessed by our decision makers.
Well, if it's okay, let me ask about the copyright debate, I guess, the copyright issue that's currently going on. Because one of the things that has been leveled at OpenAI is people saying that they violated copyright law by training AI on material that's copyrighted. And again, I thought, as this remarkable, incredibly well-published science fiction author, you would have thought about this to a great degree. If AI is trained on your materials, would you consider that a copyright violation, or would that be just kind of iterative learning, the same way a human would read a book and get concepts from it?
Well, as a person who lives by some degree of copyright protection of the things that I write, naturally I'm biased to being able to continue to have a living this way. It's terribly important that we remember that lawyers, and we'll keep coming back to lawyers, lawyers figured out how to use copyright to do what it was never intended to do. What was the original reason for copyright and patents? It was not because there is some intrinsic right to own information. You do not, as I point out in my 1990s book, which people are saying I should republish because it's absolutely still relevant, called The Transparent Society, and Tim will have a link for it. It includes a chapter called The End of Photography as Proof of Anything at All. This was 1997. As I pointed out there, the fundamental reason for patents and copyright and intellectual property in particular was to solve one of the greatest of all human problems. And that is, how, if you innovate, can you reliably benefit from your innovation? And for at least 6,000 years, probably much more going back to beer brewing and agriculture, but at least 6,000 years, the only way you could benefit from a new way of forging iron, or forceps, which were invented and lost at least 5 different times, we now know, or just almost anything, any technique. The only way you and your family could benefit from it is if you kept it secret. And that meant that when your city was sacked and you and your sons were killed, that innovation was lost to humanity for another several hundred years, possibly even 1,000 years. The way out was to use the law to ensure that when others used your method, you get a little something. You get a small payment. Not enough to prevent it from spreading and being used, and that's a problem with the lawyers enforcing intellectual property now. They're poisoning and destroying the fundamental purpose that IP was invented for, patents and copyrights. When they prevent it from things from spreading, because when they spread, then someone else has an idea and makes it better, and they get a little bit of IP for 20 years, and someone else leverages on theirs. That results in what's called the positive sum game. In other words, we are struggling with each other, but in the process, making everything better. So designing our civilization so it has positive sum games. And competition results in the canceling of bad things, but the cooperative development of good things. That's what Adam Smith wrote about. And we need to remember that that is the fundamental, and we can't get too distracted from it. So that's what IP is for. Now, you asked about IP in the context of AI. As I said, the fundamental reason for intellectual property was to cause more information to be shared, not to shut down the flow of information. When IP is used to shut down information flow, it's violating what it's about. As I point out in the Transparent Society, if you are trying to police the content of other people's heads, it's a losing
Yeah.
proposition. And it only benefits society's utter elites who will be better at that. On the other hand, if you created content that is being used in the training sets of AI, then you ought to benefit. Jaron Lanier had a proposal. Instead of saying, I own my information, which is aggressively saying no one else may know something, instead say, I have interest in my information. I deserve small, reasonable royalties for every use. And I deserve to
Okay.
be notified when it is used. And especially, I deserve to be notified when it's misused. Well, we have a very, very sophisticated system, and AIs could be unleashed upon giving you notice when your information is being used and mediating micropayments into your account when your information effectively helps some AI system somewhere. And that would be a reasonable thing. And I'll provide you with a link to where I talk about why micropayments systems, which we've heard about for 20 years, why they have all failed up to this point. But if they have the secret sauce, they can offer us a way out of the hell of advertising. Because advertising has been carrying the internet on its back for 30 years, and it's irritating the hell out of us, and it can't continue. So if
Yeah.
we have micropayments, then we'd be able to simply spend a nickel for a New York Times article and not have to put up with any of the rigmarole crap.
Well, and David, since you're touching on advertising, and I think this also goes back in some way to this idea of AI as lawyers, one of the things that I wanted to ask about was this increase in AI generated fake media. And I guess my specific concern is I'm seeing this on both sides of today's political election. Presumably, this will only get worse, but also higher quality, harder to detect as fake in the future. And so, one of my worries is it seems like it's going to be much easier for people, or perhaps AI itself, to leverage these technologies to persuade people to various political outcomes, right? And that's very nefarious, and obviously it'll be harder and harder to detect, if not impossible, in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, we're recording this less than 3 weeks before the US election. And of course, it's highly fraught. I happen to believe that one of the sides, to the degree that they're lying, is mostly inadvertent and not a systematic, intentional thing. And the other one is an utter cesspool of tsunami of lies. But be that as it may, what you're describing is pretty much what I talked about in the late 90s in that chapter of the Transparent Society, the end of photography as proof of anything at all. That I've
Yeah.
posted that chapter online. There is absolutely nothing obsolete about it. It might have been written yesterday, unfortunately, but the fundamental point is, and I'll be getting on about this again and again and again and again. If you see a problem with AI, how about taking a look at whether that problem already has existed among organic humans? And then ask, how did we deal with that problem? Not perfectly, we never have, but enough to have a civilization that has had better outcomes by 100-fold than all of the rest of human history combined.
Yeah.
And in this case, when it comes to misinformation, what I talk about in that chapter is we have a method for dealing with liars. We have a method for dealing with faked evidence. It's called more evidence, more witnesses. If someone lies about an event that they witnessed in public, you look first to see if there's anybody else who witnessed it. And if you do, then the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which is as sacred as the First and the Fifth and not discussed, means that you can demand evidence that proves that the assertions made against you are lies. You have that fundamental right. Now, in the case of AIs, how are you going to catch them? Well, for the last year, you've looked at the fingers. For some reason, AIs are really good at faces. Too perfect, actually. The AIs can catch each other. That's a clue because of the perfection of the faces. But for the last year, until this last month, you could look at the fingers because AIs had a terrible time with their autocomplete methodologies at doing human hands. And one of the campaigns in this election was caught with their fearless leader having 7 or 8 fingers in all of these faked things. It was just really pathetic. In any event, the point is that as this develops, human beings won't be able to be the ones who spot this. But already there are AI systems that are being used by news media to determine whether or not an image was faked. And I expect they're going to be able to do this almost indefinitely if the AIs can be harnessed to serve as counter witnesses to lying AIs.
Well, so this takes us to your primary thesis, and you've gone over this before, but I think is well worth sharing again, which is AI reporting on other AI policing other AI, right?
Right, and fortunately, an editor at Wired magazine really understood what I was getting at and championed my article, which you'll no doubt link to, at which I posed this argument. But for a context, let me talk about ecosystems, and we'll get to that. We are the product of a 4 billion year ecosystem. And ecosystems occur when you have a high quality energy source, high color, directionality. All of these things make the energy source low entropy. And in the case of the Earth, that is the sun. Now, the sun is creating vast amounts of entropy, but it hits the Earth with really high quality, low entropy energy. And this sunlight strikes the Earth's surface, and photosynthetic plants are very good at supping from the gradient, the declining quality and increasing entropy of the energy. So the plants take this extremely high quality sunlight and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars, cellulose, and so on. They are grazed upon by herbivores, who again take advantage of the declining slope. Carbohydrates aren't as purely high quality, low entropy energy as sunlight, but they are concentrated, and the herbivores benefit, and the carnivores that eat the herbivores, and the thanativores that eat the decaying corpses and return the nutrients to the soil. But the entropy exports away into space as infrared. And I'll provide an illustration JPEG for you for that. And that infrared has to escape into space and carry the entropy with it, or we get into trouble, as we are right now, because the Earth cannot afford to have any more CO2 than plants need, because we skate the very inner edge of our sun's continuously habitable or Goldilocks zone. If we were farther out, we would be able to afford more CO2. But this blanket holds in the entropy that must escape in order for sunlight to do its magic. Okay, there's your ecology lesson. We did the same thing with the Industrial Revolution. We took fairly high quality energy out of coal and then oil and turned it into electricity. We turned it into steel. We turned it into cities. And so we're supping from the gradient of higher quality stored carbohydrates, or hydrocarbons now, from the Carboniferous era. What we've done recently is created an entirely new ecosystem, one in which the source is electricity and chips. And that's the high quality input. And the result is you get the equivalent of plants, which is the internet and clouds. Artificial intelligences sup off of that. There are also free-formed algorithmic entities right now that are like bacteria that spread across the internet, find some random energy, memory space and live there and parasite off each other. This has been the case for 10 years and almost nobody talks about this. So we've created a new ecosystem. And the question is, will these new artificial entities we're making be able to be part of a healthy ecosystem? Because when you don't have constraints on artificial entities, they will tend to proliferate, because that is evolution. That, whatever trait they have that enables them to proliferate and make many copies, is the trait that will dominate their nature in the future. So right now, you have these artificial entities being made by about 3 dozen companies, also governments, Beijing, the Department of Defense, and the scariest one, which is Goldman Sachs and the other Wall Street firms. Each of the top dozen Wall Street firms spends more on artificial intelligence every year than the top 20 universities combined. They hire the very best quants or mathematicians from universities, and they program these high-frequency trading programs to have 5 laws of robotics. They are not Asimov's 3 laws. The 5 laws of Wall Street robotics are: thou shalt be predatory, parasitical, amoral, secretive, and utterly insatiable. These are not 5 personality traits that we want fundamental in AI.
Yeah.
So there is a way to get Wall Street out of this business, a simple 0.01% transaction tax. As day traders or Wall Street traders, human traders, we would never even notice it, but it would kill these damn HFTs dead. And if they are listening right now, I didn't mean it at all, kids. All hail our Goldman Sachs AI overlords. Other guys help. So All right, so that's your ecosystem within which we are creating a whole raft of new life forms. And I'll talk about how we could teach them to be good children.
Well, and that is something perhaps we should come back to. I think we've run enough in terms of time to blow a ton of minds today. I think the transparent society is probably the takeaway. You have a chapter online for that. I will point people back towards the book as well as the Wired articles.
Yeah,
So,
well, in the Wired article, I lay out how the mavens geniuses who are making this new era fall prey to three cliches and you'll read their articles, they're always there, the three cliches. One is that the 36 institutions that are making these things will remain in charge of these AIs, like feudal castles. So it's feudalism like Game of Thrones or the last 6,000 years of human history. The second cliche is the blob, Steve McQueen movie, The Blob, that they will pervade everywhere. They'll seep through every crack, the AIs. And the third is SkyNet, or absolute monarchy, that they'll merge into a grand, dominant master control program. And if AI follows any of those three paths, we're utterly screwed. But in my Wired article, I talk about the essence of the fourth path. And what I find so hard to understand is why it is so hard for people to grasp, because it's what we do. The fourth path is simply what we do. And I'll leave people with this puzzle. When you are attacked, and many of you in the audience have been in your life, by a hyper intensely artificially intelligent, predatory, parasitical entity with huge linguistic skills called a lawyer. When you are attacked by one of these predatory, hyper intelligent linguistic entities, what do you do? What do you do? The solution is right there. And if we get AIs to be incentivized to do what I talk about in my Wired article, and we can come back to it on another occasion, Tim.
oh, absolutely.
We have a potential soft landing. I'm not saying that it will work. What I'm saying is that if you look at the last 200 years of gradually augmenting Enlightenment civilization, you realize that it's the only thing that can work. It might. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when our AI kids watch this, hey kids, you being good?
Well, David, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today and for an amazing cliffhanger that we will have to come back to. Again, I'm going to direct people to your website. I'll put links into davidbrin.com as well as the Transparent Society and the Wired article. And so we will send them there to kind of do more research. I would love to do another interview with you in the future. But let me close by asking, what is coming up in the last part of 2024, early part of 2025 for you?
Well, I'm going to Caltech tomorrow. They are giving me an honor that I did not expect, having gone to a place where that unleashed on the world people like Steve Koonin and Joe Kirschvink and Ken Suslick. But I won't turn it down. Anyway, I'm developing 2 different pay-it-forward science fiction series for young adult and teen readers. And I'm sure you'll offer a link to them below.
Absolutely.
And great adventures for teen readers. For example, in one of the series, aliens kidnap a California high school and live to regret it. And in the other one, in the future, Only teenagers can teleport through space and time. And the time travel thing is the most important because they bring kids from the past into the future to help solve their problems. So, trying to, just make the best of these declining years.
You were not declining at all, sir.
This
You were
is still hanging in there.
wonderful. David, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Hang in there, guys. Do well in the next 3 weeks that are probably in the past tense for Tim, but come on, it's a civilization.